The gunman left behind not only YouTube videos in which he discussed killing sorority girls and all the girls who had rejected him sexually, keeping him in a life of virginity. He also left behind this, a 140-page manifesto suggesting that this was so premeditated that he had time to write and to rewrite and draft. It is the ramblings of a man who begins counting his life from the age of 0 up until 22. It is titled My Twisted World, the story of Elliot Rodger, a 140-page manifesto justifying, apparently, or at least shedding insight into what he did, this horrible tragedy. First of all, Brian, let me ask you, you see something like this manifesto. How do you as a defense, as a criminal defense lawyer, even try to defend against something like this when it is so clearly spelled out about what his mental state was?
Well, Deborah, I think what the manifesto reveals is that he was previewing what he was going to do. And that gets to a very important point that I want to make, that's vastly different than what other members of the panel have said. I think a big issue here that we have to take a look at is, when did the family first report to law enforcement the YouTube clip or any comments that he made about wanting to slaughter people? And then we've got to look at how much time law enforcement had to really do an investigation in this, because in the aftermath of Sandy Hook and Aurora, everybody was out there saying, why didn't somebody report this before it happened? Here we have somebody reporting it. We have a family member reporting this to law enforcement. Why wasn't there an immediate intervention? Because I think your psychologist guest will agree that a lot of times in mass murder, the person who's going to do it, they're crying out for help. They want somebody to grab them, intervene, and stop them from doing that. So we need to investigate why there was a big gap in not investigating this once it was reported to law enforcement.
You know, Brian Claypool, you earlier said that, you know, this is something that you don't know whether enough was done or enough could be done. Have you dealt with a criminal defendant like this person before? And again, I'm going to cut you off if they start talking, so just beware.
Sure. Deborah, I've actually dealt with plenty of civil rights cases in which victims have been shot by law enforcement and they have been mentally challenged and they've had mental disabilities. So I'm very sensitive to the mental health aspect of this. And all I'm trying to say here is that in a situation like this and the other mass shootings we've had, you've got to look at the red flags. There are red flags. What we as a society do with these red flags is really the teachable moment in all of this. And for example, you know, Lou was talking a little bit about gun control. I think maybe a suggestion I have is, and tell me somebody out there if we don't already have it, is if somebody is treated by a psychologist and there is a medication prescribed to that patient that deals with depression, anger, rage, or a mental disorder, and they already own a gun, then somehow we have to have a system in place where the gun can be revoked, that there's a procedure in place to do that. So I think there's things we have to do here to try to take back the guns if there is a mental disability, if that makes sense.
And we want to welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world. We have the very latest on this shooting rampage that took place in a college town, Isla Vista, right near the University of California, Santa Barbara. We're now learning that at least 3 of those who were killed were in fact students at that college. There are 3 others who have yet to be identified. They were killed at the beginning. We are told that Elliot Rodger, the suspect named as the killer, stabbed these 3 men repeatedly. We're not sure whether they're not being identified because they can't make an identification or because they've not yet notified those closest to them. And Brian Claypool, the first incident in which he had an interaction, the first interaction that he had was back in July 2013. Brian Claypool, apparently he made up charges that he was the one who had been the victim of an assault when deputies found out that in fact he was the aggressor. What does that tell you about him?
Well, it tells me that he's delusional, and Jeff made a good point too about the fact that anybody would file a report about stolen candles. I mean, you have to connect the dots, Deborah, and it's all about the red flags. That's what I talked about earlier. The red flags were very apparent here. And I've dealt with law enforcement before with mental health suspects. You have to call in. A lot of law enforcement have what's called a KIT team. It's a critical intervention team. When you get a call about a welfare check, you have to call in a mental health specialist. If you don't, it's like saying, somebody has a drinking problem. Can you go interview them and ask them whether they have a drinking problem? What do you think they're going to tell you? They're going to tell you, I don't have a drinking problem. What are you talking about? So we needed a mental...
Yeah.
A fifth night of protests rocking Baltimore overnight.
We are people that are tired, frustrated, and we want answers now.
Marchers once again demanding answers in the death of Freddie Gray, taking their questions and their message to the steps of the Baltimore Police Department. Correspondent Brian Todd capturing the moment the crowd swarmed as police were trying to arrest a protester.
And here they just got another man. Well, we're being easy, guys. We're being pushed, but you can see what's going on. When they try to arrest someone, they are being swarmed by these protesters. Okay, ma'am, thank you. And some objects are being thrown. I'm not sure why that man was arrested. Didn't see what he allegedly did.
An attorney for the police union confirms that Freddie Gray was not wearing a seatbelt when he was placed in a transport vehicle. Morning, let's talk more about this. I'm joined by criminal defense attorney Brian Claypool. Welcome, Brian.
Hi, Carol.
We know that that Freddie Gray was put into that police vehicle in handcuffs originally. Then at some point during the trip to the police station, police stopped the van and put leg shackles on him, yet did not restrain him in any way, seatbelt him anyway in the back of that van. So it's becoming increasingly apparent, isn't it, that that's how his injuries might have arisen?
Well, Carol, I'm not so sure of that, and I'll tell you why. The videotape of Freddie Gray only started when he was on the ground. We don't really know what transpired exactly with the police officers leading up to him being on the ground. His spine was 80% severed. His voice box was crushed. I find it hard to believe that that would happen in a van. And some of the police officers had it looked like they had their knees in his back. And Carol, go back to that video. When they picked up Freddie Gray, it looked like he had trouble even walking on his own. They were carrying him, looked like they were throwing a slab of meat into a freezer. So I'm not even sure it happened inside the van. But let's talk about inside the van. First of all, police officers, before they even put him in the van, have a constitutional duty to call for medical aid if a suspect is injured. I've handled about 10 death cases in the last decade, and I've dealt with this issue. They should have called the paramedics before he was even thrown in the van, Carol. He was screaming and yelling in pain. Once he's in the van, he needs to be seatbelted. And Carol, why is nobody talking about the failure to have video cameras inside the jailhouse van? Wouldn't we know then, really, if anything in the van caused this as well? And then we have a 30-minute gap. Why didn't somebody call for paramedics during that 30-minute window as well? And I'm sure he was booked as well in the jailhouse. Why didn't somebody, when they talked to him when he first arrived, say, hey, wait a minute, this guy's not well, let's call for help?
I don't know. Everybody wants answers to those very questions. Brian, back to you. There was a former Baltimore police detective on New Day this morning. His name was Joseph Crystal. He told us he was actually harassed by fellow officers, when he was with the Baltimore Police Department, when he reported a case of police brutality. Listen.
To a supervisor within my division to report the incident. And when I did that, I was told simply if I were to snitch or that basically my career would be over. His exact words to me were, if you snitch, your career is done.
So Brian, this is concerning, right? Because this could enter into this case as well.
Carol, this happens all the time. I've dealt with this for the past 10 years. There is a flat-out categorical code of silence within police departments. You've got to stick with your team. You can't say anything negative or adverse against other police officers, or else you will face retribution. You will face retaliation. You will be harassed by other police officers as well, Carol. And if I may comment too, one other thing that I'm concerned about in this case is this is unlike a lot of other death cases at the hand of law enforcement, like Mike Brown. We didn't really know what transpired. We needed forensics. We needed DNA. We needed to see whether there was a scuffle. Here, Carol, we have flat out, uncontroverted facts that Freddie Gray was physically perfectly fine before he was detained without any probable cause, and 40 minutes later, he had a severed spine and a crushed voice box, and he was only at the hands of police custody. So we already have a lot of questions answered, and it should not take long to indict some or all of these police officers.
Well, we'll see what happens in the days to come. There is a news conference scheduled for next hour. Of course, we'll be following that. My thanks to both of you, Delegate Keith Haynes and Brian Claypool.